A murder scene can be cleaned. A witness can lie. A suspect can destroy a phone, burn clothing, or disappear across a border. But there is one kind of witness a killer almost never thinks about. The animal, sitting quietly in the corner. A dog that refuses to leave a certain road. A bird that suddenly repeats words nobody wants to hear. A cat whose hair ends up somewhere it should never have been. Tonight, we're looking at 4 disturbing cases where pets became the strangest pieces of evidence investigators had, and in some cases, the only reason the truth was ever discovered. Story 1. The bird that fought back at 11:43 on a rainy Thursday night. Police received a call from a neighbor who lived 3 houses away. She had heard something crashing inside the home next door. Not a normal crash. There had been shouting first, then what sounded like furniture being dragged across a hardwood floor, and finally, several sharp screams, followed by complete silence. The house belonged to 2-year-old Martin Hale, a retired electrical contractor who lived alone except for an animal he'd owned for almost a decade. A large blue and yellow macaw named Jasper. Martin had bought Jasper after his wife died, and over the years, the bird had become less like a pet and more like a member of the family. Jasper knew several dozen words. He recognized familiar voices. He could imitate the sound of Martin's old telephone. And according to Martin's daughter, there was one thing Jasper absolutely hated: strangers entering the house after dark. If someone he didn't know approached Martin aggressively, Jasper would scream. Sometimes he would even fly toward them. That detail would become important later. When officers arrived that night, Martin's front door was partially open. The porch light was on. Rainwater had blown across the entryway. There was no car in the driveway. The neighbor who called police was standing across the street, wrapped in a coat and watching the house through the rain. She told officers she'd seen a dark sedan parked outside earlier, but by the time she heard the final scream, it was gone. 2 officers entered with flashlights drawn. The first thing they noticed was the silence. No television, no music, no barking, nothing. Then they saw the living room. A chair had been knocked onto its side. A lamp was shattered. A wooden table had been pushed several feet across the floor. And near the hallway, a trail of dark droplets disappeared toward the kitchen. Martin was found beside the refrigerator. He had suffered severe injuries to his head and chest. One of his hands was still clenched around a piece of torn fabric. Investigators immediately assumed the attacker had left through the rear door. Then, an officer heard something moving upstairs. He looked toward the ceiling. A faint scraping sound came from the second floor. The officers checked the rooms one by one. Nothing. Then they reached Martin's bedroom. The curtains were moving because the window was open. The bed had been disturbed. And sitting on the curtain rod was Jasper. The bird was completely still. His feathers were wet. One wing was hanging lower than the other. But there was something else. Dark red stains covered the feathers around his beak. At first, investigators assumed the blood belonged to Martin. That assumption would turn out to be wrong. A veterinarian was called to examine Jasper because the bird had suffered a deep cut across one foot. He was alive, but badly injured. The veterinarian also noticed several small pieces of human skin caught beneath Jasper's claws. That immediately changed the direction of the investigation. If Jasper had attacked someone, then whoever entered the house that night may have left injured. The crime scene team began searching for traces of blood that didn't belong to Martin. They found a smear on the edge of the kitchen counter. Another appeared on the inside of the back door. A third was found on a broken piece of glass. None matched Martin. Investigators collected all 3 samples. But there was a problem. The house had no working security cameras. Martin's phone was missing. The neighbor had only seen the suspect's vehicle for a few seconds, and nobody had witnessed the attack. For nearly a week, detectives had little more than a damaged house, an injured bird, and several unidentified blood samples. Then, they learned about Martin's former business partner. His name was Glenn Mercer. The 2 men had worked together for nearly 20 years before their relationship collapsed over money. According to Martin's daughter, Glenn had demanded repayment for equipment he claimed Martin had taken. Martin denied owing him anything. The argument became so serious that Martin had recently told friends he no longer wanted Glenn anywhere near his home. When detectives interviewed Glenn, He claimed he'd spent the entire night at a motel outside town. He said he had never visited Martin. His clothing contained no visible blood. His car appeared clean, and there was no obvious reason to arrest him. So investigators waited for the laboratory results. The first blood sample came back. It did not belong to Martin. It belonged to Glenn Mercer. Detectives returned to his motel room. This time, they asked a different question. Why would Glenn's blood be inside Martin's house? Glenn changed his story. He said he had visited Martin earlier that evening. He claimed they'd argued, but he left before anything happened. When detectives asked about the cut on his hand, he said he'd injured it while repairing a broken window. But there was no broken window at the motel, and the cut was fresh. The investigators then showed him photographs of Jasper. Glenn stared at the bird for several seconds. Then he asked a question that detectives later described as strange. He wanted to know whether the bird was still alive. That was the moment investigators realized Glenn already knew something about Jasper's injuries. He had never been told that the bird had been hurt. Glenn eventually admitted he'd gone to Martin's house that night, but he still denied killing him. According to his new version of events, Martin attacked him first. Glenn claimed they fought near the kitchen. He said Martin fell. Then Jasper suddenly flew toward him. The bird struck his face repeatedly and grabbed his hand. Glenn said he panicked. He tried to push the bird away. During the struggle, Jasper bit deeply into his hand. Glenn then fled through the back door, but investigators didn't believe the rest of his story. Martin had injuries consistent with a prolonged assault, and the blood trail showed that Glenn had moved through several rooms after being injured. The final piece came from Jasper himself. During the forensic examination, investigators discovered that one of the feathers near his cage contained a tiny fragment of fabric. It matched the same dark jacket Glenn had been wearing that evening. Glenn eventually confessed. He had gone to Martin's house intending to frighten him into paying money. The confrontation became violent. Martin tried to defend himself. Glenn attacked him, but Jasper reacted. The bird flew directly toward Glenn and began biting his hands and face. Glenn struck the bird with a metal object before escaping. He believed he'd destroyed every piece of evidence that could connect him to the house. He hadn't. His own blood was on the kitchen counter. His skin was beneath Jasper's claws. His jacket fibers were caught in the bird's feathers. And the injury on his hand matched the attack Jasper had survived. Glenn was eventually convicted of murder. Jasper survived his injuries and was taken in by Martin's daughter. She kept the bird's cage in the same room where Martin had once kept it. Years later, she told investigators that Jasper still became agitated whenever someone entered the house unexpectedly at night. But there was one difference. He never again allowed anyone to touch the old cage. Because on the night his owner was attacked, the bird hadn't simply witnessed what happened. He had fought back, and in doing so, he left behind the evidence that a killer thought he'd taken with him. Story 2. The dog that wouldn't leave at 2:18 in the morning. A delivery driver noticed a dog standing in the middle of an empty industrial road. The animal wasn't wandering aimlessly. It was staring toward a narrow driveway between two warehouses. Every few seconds, the dog would turn around and look back at the road, as if waiting for someone. The driver slowed his van. The dog immediately ran toward him. It was a medium-sized black and white border collie. Its collar was still attached. There was a small metal tag hanging from it. The driver stopped and opened the passenger door. The dog climbed inside. That was when he noticed the blood. There were dark stains across the dog's front legs. The driver called the number printed on the collar. Nobody answered. He called again. Still nothing. Finally, he contacted local police. An officer arrived about 15 minutes later. The dog was frightened, but strangely determined. Whenever the officer tried to move him toward the patrol vehicle, he pulled in the opposite direction, toward the warehouses. The officer followed. The dog led him down the narrow driveway and stopped in front of a gray service door. He began scratching at it. The officer tried the handle. It was unlocked. Inside was a small storage building. There were shelves along the walls, boxes on the floor, and a single fluorescent light buzzing overhead. The dog ran inside, then stopped. At the back of the building was a second door. The officer opened it. Beyond it was a small office. And inside that office was the dog's owner. His name was Daniel Price. He was 47 years old, and he was dead. Daniel had suffered a fatal injury to the back of his head. A broken telephone lay near his hand. His desk had been overturned. One drawer had been ripped open. The police immediately sealed the building, but the dog refused to leave. He sat beside Daniel's body and stared at the doorway. Investigators later learned that the dog's name was Ranger. Daniel had adopted him from a shelter 5 years earlier. Ranger had been trained to stay close to Daniel while he worked. Employees at the warehouse said the two were almost never apart. If Daniel went outside, Ranger followed. If Daniel moved to another building, Ranger followed. That night, Ranger had apparently done the same thing, but somehow he'd escaped. The first question was simple. How had the dog gotten out? The rear door showed signs of forced entry. There was blood on the handle. Investigators also found muddy footprints leading from the office to the back alley, but the footprints stopped near a loading area. There were no obvious tracks beyond that. Daniel's phone was missing. His wallet was still in his pocket. His vehicle was parked outside. Nothing valuable appeared to have been stolen. That suggested the murder wasn't a robbery. Then police discovered something unusual. Ranger had a small amount of blood on his collar. It didn't match Daniel. The laboratory later confirmed that the blood belonged to another person, someone who had been inside the building. Detectives began reviewing Daniel's recent contacts. One name appeared repeatedly, a former employee named Marcus Reed. Marcus had worked at the warehouse until Daniel fired him 6 weeks earlier. The reason was theft. Several shipments had gone missing. Daniel had accused Marcus of taking them. Marcus denied it, but the firing had left him angry. When police interviewed him, Marcus admitted arguing with Daniel earlier that week. He denied being at the warehouse that night. His alibi was a friend who claimed Marcus had been at his apartment. The problem was that the friend couldn't remember exactly when Marcus arrived. There was no surveillance footage covering the entire building, and the blood found on Ranger's collar had not yet been identified. Then investigators discovered something else. A security camera from a gas station across the road had captured a dark pickup leaving the industrial area at approximately 2:30 a.m. The license plate was partially visible. It belonged to Marcus. Detectives brought him in again. This time, Marcus admitted driving near the warehouse, but he claimed he never went inside. He said he had simply driven past. The investigators asked him about the blood. Marcus said he didn't know anything about it. 2 days later, the laboratory returned the results. The blood on Ranger's collar belonged to Marcus Reed. Now, detectives had a problem for Marcus. If he hadn't entered the building, how had his blood gotten onto Daniel's dog? Marcus still denied killing Daniel. But his story changed for the third time. He said he'd gone to confront Daniel about the stolen shipments. According to Marcus, Daniel had grabbed him first. They fought. Marcus said he struck Daniel once, panicked, and ran. He claimed Ranger attacked him as he escaped. The investigators asked why he hadn't called for help. Marcus had no answer. They asked why he had taken Daniel's phone. Again, no answer. The missing phone was eventually recovered in a storm drain several streets away. Investigators found Marcus's fingerprints on the case. But there was another clue. Ranger had mud on his paws. The mud contained a distinctive mixture of red clay and fine gravel. That mixture was not present around the warehouse. It was present at an abandoned construction site, nearly half a mile away. Police searched the site. They found a jacket hidden behind a concrete barrier. The jacket contained Daniel's blood. It also contained Marcus's DNA. The timeline became clear. Marcus had attacked Daniel. Ranger had tried to intervene. Marcus injured his own hand during the struggle. He then fled through the rear door. Ranger followed him into the alley. Marcus tried to shake the dog by running toward the construction site, but Ranger continued following. At some point, Marcus managed to escape. He threw his jacket behind the barrier and ran toward the road. Ranger eventually found his way back. Instead of running home, the dog returned to the place where Daniel had been killed. Then, he waited, and when a stranger finally arrived, Ranger did something that changed the entire investigation. He led the officer directly to the building. Marcus was arrested 3 days later. At trial, prosecutors used the blood on Ranger's collar, the jacket at the construction sites, the surveillance footage, and the recovered phone to establish the timeline. Marcus was convicted of murder, but the most emotional moment came after the verdict. Daniel's sister adopted Ranger. The dog continued living with her for the rest of his life. She later said that Ranger seemed to recognize the road where the warehouse had stood. Whenever they drove past it, he became restless. And sometimes, he would press his nose against the window and stare toward the old loading area. He couldn't tell investigators what he'd seen. He couldn't describe the man who attacked Daniel. He couldn't identify a face, but he knew exactly where his owner had been. And when the world around him had gone silent, Ranger refused to leave until someone followed him back there. Story 3. The parrot that remembered the house. The first thing police heard when they entered the apartment was a woman crying. The sound came from the living room. One officer immediately moved toward it. Then, the crying stopped. The apartment was silent. There was nobody there, except the victim. And a green parrot sitting inside a cage. A few seconds later, the bird began crying again. But this time, it wasn't making a woman's voice. It was imitating one. The words were simple. "Don't lock the door." Then the bird screamed, "Please." The officers didn't understand what they were hearing. They assumed the parrot had learned the phrases from television, or from a neighbor, or perhaps from the victim herself. But the longer they stayed inside that apartment, the more disturbing the recordings became. The victim was 39-year-old Hannah Mercer. She lived alone with the parrot, a small green Amazon named Milo. Hannah worked at a pharmacy and was described by friends as quiet and private. She rarely complained. She didn't like talking about personal problems. But several neighbors had noticed something unusual during the months before her death. Arguments, late at night. A man's voice, doors slamming, and sometimes Hannah shouting for someone to leave. Police had never been called. Nobody wanted to get involved. Then, one Sunday morning, Hannah's landlord found her apartment door unlocked. He knocked. Nobody answered. He entered. Hannah was lying on the bedroom floor. There were injuries around her neck and bruising across her arms. The room showed signs of a struggle. A bedside lamp had been broken. A drawer had been pulled open. Her phone was missing. There was no obvious murder weapon. The police initially suspected someone had broken in, but nothing valuable appeared to be missing. The strange thing was Milo. The bird sat quietly in his cage. He seemed completely calm. Until one officer walked toward him. Milo suddenly screamed, "Don't touch me!" The officer froze. Nobody in the room had said those words. The bird repeated them. Then he made a sound, like a door slamming. After that came a man's voice. "You're not going anywhere." The room became completely silent. The officers exchanged looks. They began recording the bird. For the next several minutes, Milo repeated fragments of conversations. Some were ordinary, some were frightening. "Put that down." "Stop. Please don't." Then one phrase appeared repeatedly. "Not again." Investigators initially treated the recordings as suspicious but unreliable. A parrot could imitate almost anything. There was no way to know when the phrases had been learned. So detectives focused on Hannah's personal life. They learned she'd recently ended a relationship with a man named Adrian Cole. Adrian had lived with Hannah for almost a year. According to neighbors, the relationship had become increasingly volatile. Hannah had eventually asked him to move out. Adrian claimed he hadn't seen her in 3 weeks. He said the breakup had been peaceful. But Hannah's friend gave detectives a different story. She said Hannah had told her that Adrian kept returning to the apartment. He had a spare key. He knew when Hannah worked, and he'd become angry whenever she refused to let him back inside. Police searched Adrian's apartment. They found nothing immediately connecting him to the murder, but detectives noticed scratches on his right hand. Adrian said he'd cut himself while moving a piece of furniture. The explanation sounded plausible. Then the laboratory found Hannah's blood beneath his fingernails. Adrian was arrested. But the case still had a problem. The defense could argue that the blood came from an earlier relationship. There was no eyewitness, no murder weapon, no reliable video, and Milo's strange phrases couldn't legally explain what happened. Investigators decided to reconstruct the apartment. They placed a recording device near the bird's cage and played ordinary sounds from Hannah's home. a door opening, a telephone ringing, footsteps, a key entering a lock. Milo reacted to the key sound immediately. He began shouting, "Who's there?" Then he became agitated. "Go away!" The investigators realized something. Milo wasn't randomly repeating phrases. He associated certain sounds with specific words. They continued the experiment. A recording of a door locking caused Milo to repeat, "Don't lock it." A recording of heavy footsteps caused him to say, "Please stop." And when investigators played the sound of a man shouting, Milo screamed, "Not again." That didn't prove Adrian had killed Hannah, but it suggested the bird had repeatedly witnessed frightening encounters. Investigators then interviewed neighbors again. One woman remembered hearing Hannah say something very specific several weeks before the murder. "Adrian, put the keys down." Another neighbor remembered a man's voice responding, "You don't need to know where I'm going." The investigators compared those statements with Milo's vocabulary. The bird had repeatedly said, "Keys, don't lock. Where are you going?" Then came the phrase that changed the case. During another recording session, Milo suddenly said, "Bedroom, now." Those words had never been mentioned by investigators. They asked Hannah's friend if she recognized the phrase. She did. She said Hannah used to tell Adrian to go to the bedroom whenever they argued, because she didn't want their fights happening in front of Milo. The bird had apparently memorized the entire pattern. It wasn't a recording of the murder. It was a collection of fragments from months of life inside the apartment. The prosecutors eventually presented Milo's recordings not as a direct identification of the killer, but as evidence supporting the testimony of people who had described Hannah's relationship. The physical evidence did the rest. Hannah's blood was found on Adrian. His fingerprints were recovered from the apartment. His phone connected to a cell tower near Hannah's building on the night he claimed to be hundreds of miles away, and investigators discovered that his spare key had been used to enter the apartment. Adrian changed his story again. He said he'd gone there to talk. He claimed Hannah attacked him. Then he said she fell. Then he admitted grabbing her, but he continued denying that he'd intended to kill her. The jury rejected his explanation. He was convicted. Afterward, Hannah's sister took Milo home. She kept the bird's cage beside a window overlooking the backyard. For months, Milo continued repeating old phrases. Some were harmless, some were painful. And occasionally, when someone reached for the front door keys, the bird would become silent. Then he would whisper, "Don't lock the door." Hannah's sister eventually stopped keeping keys near the cage. She said it was too difficult to hear, but she also refused to give the bird away, because Milo had spent months listening to things nobody else wanted to hear. And when Hannah was gone, the bird was left carrying fragments of a life that had been hidden behind a closed apartment door. He couldn't tell police who Hannah's killer was, but he remembered the fear. And sometimes, that was enough to make people finally listen. Story 4. The cat hair that changed forensics. The evidence looked almost worthless. A single strand of pale fur caught inside the lining of a winter coat. It was so small that an investigator nearly brushed it away. The coat had been recovered from an abandoned vehicle connected to a missing woman's disappearance. There was blood on the fabric, there were traces of mud, there were fingerprints on the zipper, but the fur seemed irrelevant until someone asked a simple question. What if it wasn't from the woman? The case began 3 days earlier. 36-year-old Claire Donovan had left her workplace shortly after sunset. She told a coworker she was going home. She never arrived. Her car was discovered the next morning, beside an access road outside the city. The driver's door was open, the engine was cold. Her purse was still inside. Her keys were on the passenger seats. But Claire was gone. Police initially treated the case as a missing person investigation. Then they found blood. It was concentrated along the driver's side door. More blood appeared on the steering wheel. There was enough to suggest Claire had suffered an injury inside the vehicle. A search of the surrounding area produced little. No body, no weapon, no obvious footprints. But investigators did find a dark winter coat, approximately half a mile away. It was lying beneath a pile of branches. The coat was not Claire's. Inside one pocket was a broken watch. The blood on the coat matched Claire. That meant whoever wore it had been exposed to her blood. Detectives began investigating Claire's relationships. One man quickly became the focus. His name was Victor Lane. Victor had once been Claire's business partner. The partnership had collapsed after a dispute over money. Claire had accused Victor of moving company funds into a private account. Victor denied the accusation. They had recently begun legal proceedings against each other. When detectives asked Victor where he'd been the night Claire disappeared, he said he'd been home. He claimed he hadn't spoken to Claire for nearly 2 weeks, but investigators discovered his vehicle had been recorded near Claire's office. Victor said he had been driving through the area. He denied stopping. Then investigators searched his home. They found a pair of boots with mud on the soles. The mud was similar to soil found beside Claire's abandoned vehicle. Still, it wasn't enough. Victor's lawyer immediately argued that the evidence was circumstantial. And technically, it was. The coat could have been stolen. The blood could have been transferred. The boots could have been worn anywhere. Investigators needed something stronger. That's when they noticed the fur. It was pale, almost white, and it was trapped deep inside the coat lining. A laboratory technician examined it under magnification. The structure didn't look like human hair. It appeared to be animal fur, more specifically, cat fur. Detectives asked Victor whether he owned a cat. He said no. That should have ended the lead. But investigators learned Victor had been living with his elderly mother. She owned a white Persian cat named Marble. Victor claimed the cat never left the house. That statement created a new problem. If the fur came from Marble, how had it gotten inside the coat? Investigators collected fur from Marble. They compared the samples. Under a microscope, the fur appeared almost identical. But microscopic similarity wasn't enough to prove the source. At the time, animal DNA testing was still an emerging field. The laboratory could establish that the fur came from a cat. But connecting it to one specific animal required a much more sophisticated analysis. So, investigators sent samples to a veterinary genetics laboratory. The researchers extracted DNA from the root of the fur found in the coat. There was barely enough material. For days, the scientists weren't sure whether the sample would produce a usable profile. Eventually, it did. The genetic profile matched Marble. But defense attorneys later raised an obvious objection. What if another cat had the same profile? The investigators needed to establish how unusual the match was. They collected samples from cats across the surrounding region. They tested 25 unrelated animals. None matched. The genetic combination found in the coat was extremely rare. That didn't prove Victor had killed Claire. But it proved something important. The coat had been inside Victor's household. And Victor had denied ever owning it. Detectives returned to his home. This time, they asked about the coat. Victor said he had never seen it. Then they showed him a photograph. He stared at it. His mother looked at him. She immediately recognized it. She said it belonged to Victor. According to her, he'd owned it for several winters. Victor's story collapsed. But Claire was still missing. Police searched the area around the abandoned vehicle again. This time, they focused on routes, connecting the road to Victor's property. Several miles away, officers found an old drainage culvert. Inside were pieces of burned clothing. One fragment contained Claire's blood. Another contained fibers from the coat. A third contained Victor's DNA. Investigators now believed Victor had attempted to destroy evidence. The search expanded. 3 days later, a volunteer search team found disturbed soil near a wooded embankment. Underneath it was Claire. She had suffered multiple injuries. Her death was ruled a homicide. Victor was arrested. At trial, prosecutors reconstructed the case. Claire's blood inside the car. Victor's vehicle near her workplace. The coat hidden along the escape route. Claire's blood on the coat. Victor's DNA on the burned clothing. And the cat fur embedded in the coat. The defense argued that the cat hair didn't prove anything. They were right about one thing. The fur alone couldn't prove murder. But evidence rarely works that way. The fur connected the coat to Victor's home. The coat connected Victor to Claire's blood. The blood connected the coat to the attack. And the remaining evidence connected Victor to the disappearance. The jury convicted him of murder. The case became notable among forensic investigators because animal evidence had played such an unusual role. Not because a cat had witnessed the crime, not because Marble had recognized a killer. The cat had simply existed. It had shed fur, and one microscopic strand had traveled from the animal's body onto a piece of clothing. The killer had never noticed it. Nobody would have noticed it without a microscope. But that tiny strand survived everything else. The rain, the abandoned vehicle, the attempt to hide the coat, and the effort to destroy the evidence. After the trial, Marble remained with Victor's mother. She later told reporters that the cat had never seemed different during the investigation. He still slept in the same chair, still waited beside the kitchen window, still followed her from room to room. He had no idea that something as ordinary as his fur had helped investigators uncover a murder. And that may be the most disturbing thing about evidence left behind by animals. A killer can think about cameras, they can think about fingerprints, they can think about DNA, they can think about phones and witnesses, but they rarely think about the quiet animal sitting in the corner. The cat doesn't need to understand the crime, it only needs to leave something behind. And sometimes, one tiny strand is enough. Image, video footage keywords, white Persian cat, sitting inside quiet house abandoned car on wooded rural road at dusk. Forensic investigator finding hair on black coat laboratory microscope, examining animal hair. DNA police search wooded embankment evidence markers. Outrow, ENDCTA. 4 different animals. 4 completely different investigations. And none of them understood what a crime scene was. They didn't know what DNA meant. They couldn't testify in court. They couldn't point at a suspect and explain what they'd seen. But each animal left behind something humans couldn't ignore. A bird fought an attacker and carried traces of the struggle on its body. A dog refused to abandon the place where his owner had been killed. A parrot repeated fragments of conversations that revealed what had been happening behind a closed door. And a cat left behind a microscopic clue that connected a piece of clothing to a suspect's home. That's what makes these cases so unsettling. Sometimes the evidence isn't hidden in a safe. Sometimes it isn't locked inside a computer. Sometimes it isn't buried underground. Sometimes it's sitting quietly in a cage, waiting beside a door, running down an empty road, or shedding fur onto a coat. And the person responsible never realizes that the smallest witness in the room may be the one thing they can't silence. If you enjoy disturbing true crime style stories where the strangest clues lead investigators toward the truth, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because the next case may begin with something nobody considers evidence at all. And by the time investigators realize what they're looking at, the animal may have already told them everything it could.